Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm sorry I'm not in sunny Honolulu to give this talk, but only in rainy London. I thought I'd start by answering the question, is China a threat? Now, that might be a strange thing to do with an American audience, because I think that you're more attuned to it than we are, but it's a fairly common query that you get when you're over here, much, I think, to my surprise, when I spent so much time looking at the Chinese Communist Party. But I think it's worth just starting that with that, because that's, as it were, sets the ground for the science and technology aspect of that threat. And threat to me is a question of attitude, intent, and capability. And I don't think we should doubt the attitude of the Chinese Communist Party. Those of you who spend your time indulging in reading and listening to what it says will know that it talks all the time about an existential struggle, particularly with America, of course, but the West generally. It talks about hostile forces. It talks about our appalling universal values and how dangerous those are. Some of you will be well familiar with document number 9, which came out in April 2013, and basically excoriates all the underpinnings of our value system. So what with accusing us of color revolutions and pitting our system against their system, and increasingly talk of exporting China's form of modernization, not the entire system, but exporting that to the world. I think there's no doubt at all that they regard us as a threat and as hostile forces. If you come to intent, I point to the second centennial goal that Xi Jinping talks an awful lot about, which is by the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. China will be, and forgive me if I get the adjectives in the wrong order, but a strong, socialist, modern, harmonious, civilized, something else country. But I think you want to translate that from party speak into pure, proper English. And that really says, we're going to become the #1 superpower. We're going to knock America off its perch. And we're going to change global governance and values so that they better suit our way of life than the previous system. So I don't think there's, and again, one can look at the things that the party says to back up that interpretation of the second centennial goal. And then when it comes to the sort of capability and the building up of that and the methods, I'll very quickly just list them as I see them, ending with the 3 which I think are the most important in many ways, which is the science and technological ones. And then I'll move on from there. But I think if you were to say, what is China doing in terms of its building up its capability and its methodology, I would say 10 things. First of all, deliberately pitting its economic model and its standards against ours. Secondly, it loves to use the sticks and carrots of its trade and investment. If you're with us, says the Chinese Communist Party, then you'll get great benefits in trade and investment. And if you're against us, then won't betide you. We can talk about actually how real those threats are. I don't believe they're nearly as big as some in our countries seem to think. Military build-up, of course, that's important. Fourthly, I would put the enormous effort that the Chinese Communist Party puts into external propaganda. Fifthly, the United Front Work Department. So if external propaganda is China doing its bit in foreign countries, this is foreign countries internally doing their bit for China from the inside. And we could talk about the United Front at length, I'm sure. Sixthly, changing the global governance system. That is an enormous effort in that. And seventhly, and perhaps linked to that in some ways, but it's co-opting the global south. That's something that the CCP has been really enormously into in the last couple of years, and before actually. But and finally, we get to the 7, 8, 9, and 10, all interlinked, as many of these things do overlap. Firstly, data, the use of data, the attempt to dominate data, both in terms of its production, its transmission, and its storage. Ninthly, dominate the new sciences and technologies, and particularly the industries that then depend from those new technologies. And tenthly, dependencies. And I include that in science and technology because I'm not just talking about resources like gallium or lithium or germanium or rare earths or whatever, but also about if you dominate the new sciences and technologies, then and they are then become very common within our countries, and we start relying on Chinese science and technologies, then you have an extremely powerful weapon for constructing dependencies. So, you know, when people do ask me, is China a threat? That's basically the answer I give them. It is. And of that, within that threat, I think that it's very clear that the party itself sees science and technology as the main battleground. So if I think, you know, just give you a few quotations which I've you know, when I say run across, it's very difficult not to run across these sorts of things. They're everywhere if you bother to read the Chinese, what the Chinese say to themselves, as opposed to what they say in their win-win external propaganda. So here's Xi Jinping at the June 2024 Science and Technology Conference, massive important meeting. And what he says is that science and technology is the main battleground of the international competition and crucial in reshaping the global order. And then once you have a big conference like that, you'll get all the top leaders coming out echoing Xi Jinping's words. So in August, the Minister of Science and Technology said that, that was August 24, the science and technology revolution and contest between major powers are intertwined. The underlying contest is about whose system is best. And then in the same month, the head of BGI, the Beijing Genomic Industries, who was also a very senior member actually before in the Ministry of Technology, Science and Technology, he was even more blunt. I mean, he said that the core of the US-China rivalry is the technology war. It is the deadliest battle. Indeed, it's not a battle, it's a protracted war. So that is the way that the party views it. And it takes the whole business of science and technology extremely seriously and plans for it, and always has done. So if you think back to 2006, when they produced a medium and long-term plan for science and technology development, actually they started work on that in 2003. So they've been going at this, and we want to look even further back, actually from the 50s, they've had these science and technology plans to obtain what they need. In the early days from abroad, these days not just from abroad, but from their own innovation and development. So that was 2006, but we've seen a series of them since. In 2014, the National Super Semiconductor Plan, 2015, the Made in China 2025 plan, which set out the industries which they were really going to put their effort into to dominate. 2016, there was the S&T, Science and Technology Innovation 2030 project. And all these plans are woven into the 5-year plans. Of course, behind all that, there is changes in the organizations due to who are charged with putting all these into operation. So not so long ago, a bit over a year, we had the setting up of the Commission on Science and Technology, a party commission, party very much in control of it all. I think just before I go on to a few other things, it's of course worth making the point that in our modern world, there are 3 trends which also are highly relevant to this struggle between China and the West in science and technology. I mean, the first is that our definition of critical national infrastructure must widen. I think the UK has defined it as 17 different categories, but why are we now excluding things like connected vehicles, payment systems, smart meters? If you brought all those down, you would crash an economy, crash a nation's ability to resist. I think that those now have to be considered as part of our critical national infrastructure. The other thing is that other trend, of course, is that coming down the line already here is a whole range of new technologies, not just the Internet of Things, but AI, quantum, and more to the point, these are entering our homes, they're entering our offices, they're entering everywhere in a way that they never were before. And finally, another third, if obvious point, is that the distinction between civil, military, and repressive uses of technology has entirely disappeared, or was largely disappeared. So with that sort of background, let me look a little bit closer at some of the aspects of science and technology that are concerning. Again, perhaps another background point is that in its approach, the Chinese Communist Party takes what might call a whole of state approach. So there's been some debate in the China watching world about are Chinese companies state-owned or private-owned? What's the difference, etc. I really don't think there's any difference whatsoever in terms of control and the ability of the party to use private companies for its geopolitical ends. As we know, the party's been pushing the establishment and increase of powers within private companies of the cells and branches which they have. I don't know the precise figure now of companies in China which have party cells, but in 2017 it was 73%. One imagines it's well north of that, given the effort that Xi Jinping has been putting into it. And we know anyway that the national security laws mean that individuals and organizations have to take the have to help the security authorities when asked. And even if those laws didn't exist, I think anyone who's spent any time in China knows that when the party says jump, there is really only one response, which is how high, because if you don't, your company, I think, is going to be in trouble. So that is, we have to be careful in looking at that as a whole of state approach. I think that in terms of if I may use the expression, weaponizing science and technology. I mean, China is becoming a science and technology power. It already is. It's still filling in the gaps that it misses in technology, either by licit or illicit means, from getting it from our countries. But I have absolutely no doubt that Xi Jinping is quite clear that they intend to dominate the new technologies and the industries that come from them, and to establish monopolies wherever they can. Businesses do that anyway, of course, but there's a very powerful political imperative to do that. And I think if one were to move forward and say, well, in X years' time, China has monopoly in certain crucial technologies, what happens? And I will give an example of this in a second, but there are three very big dangers if you have a monopoly. One is the dependencies. So if we're thoroughly dependent on China for a particular technology, then China can turn to the UK and say, well, we don't like your policy on Taiwan or Hong Kong or whatever it is. And you might want to be aware that you're thoroughly dependent upon us. And they're very, they will use these dependencies where they have them. The second danger is disruption. These days, I mean, you don't have to look further than what the Israelis did with Hamas to know that you can remotely disrupt. That's one example, rather vicious one. And the third is to our data. And aggregated data can become a very powerful tool for good or for ill. It can become a weapon. And it can also be very closely focused on individuals, if necessary, particularly with the use of machine learning tools and AI. So that if you want to really find out about our Prime Minister, for instance, or listen into his car as he's talking, as has happened, you can do so. And that's through the power of data. So I won't, because of time, talk so much about the outflow of data from our countries to China, which is a big problem. And we're not sufficiently, certainly here in Europe anyway, controlling that. And I think the States, where you've made far greater efforts than we have, are still having problems on that. But I do want to talk about the other way, which is the inflow of Chinese technology, with a specific example, because I don't think that either your country or my country or other liberal countries have really cottoned onto the danger there, which, and so I'm going to give the example of cellular Internet of Things modules, which is a question I've worked on for 3 or 4 years now, including trying to raise awareness over in Washington about the threat of this. Cellular modules are, because the Chinese are aiming to get a monopoly of these and working very hard through subsidizing their companies, so-called private companies, and knocking out the opposition. And there is opposition, including American companies, but also Swiss, Canadian, Japanese, Korean. A cellular module is basically a small component. Its job is connectivity. It is in many ways the gateway to computer systems, and so much in our world these days are computer systems. I mean, a car is basically a computer on wheels. And a cellular module consists of semiconductors, it's got memory, it's got processing, it connects up to the internet via an eSIM. So in much the same way as your mobile phone does. Its benefit is that it doesn't suffer from the sort of latency which you do when your internet system goes down, your Wi-Fi goes down. And that's very important when you've got enormous manufacturing processes dependent upon that, upon these very small components. Because what they're doing is sending out and sending in and linking up with other modules through the Internet of Things, so without human agency, and spreading around data, putting it so that analyzing it, sending it back with updates to make processes more efficient, etc., etc. And that's where the danger comes, because if it's a Chinese cellular module, then it will need to be, the firmware will need to be updated over the air on regular occasions, and you do not know what is coming in necessarily. You could check, but you can't check every update. So there may well be some malware in that. And these are very powerful pieces of components. I mean, let me just give you an example in terms of disruption that can be caused. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, they took hold of a whole load of John Deere agricultural machinery. So what did John Deere do? Through the cellular module, they switched it all off. Useless. Russians get a whole load of metal. But it doesn't have to be the operator that does that switching off. It could be the manufacturer of the cellular module. And if it's a Quectel module or a Fibercom module, Chinese one, they could switch it off. So, and furthermore, they could also extract an awful lot of the data that's going through there. So let me just give you a few examples of why this is such a problem. In a world, let's suppose, where China has a monopoly of these components, cellular modules, think what happens, for instance, if you do a high voltage attack. So you program every smart meter in Texas, which has a separate grid, to behave in a certain fashion at a certain time. When the weather's particularly hot, you program every single air conditioner, washing machine, washing up machine, home appliance to do exactly the same. You will bring down the grid, and you'll bring it down big time, and it'll take, I'm told by experts, maybe a year to put back up again. There are only 50 enormous transformers in the United States, knock one of those out, and a 50th of your country is 2% of your country is without electricity for a year. That's one thing. Why is America so worried about cranes, ZPMC or ZPMC cranes, as you'd say, in your ports? Because of the cellular module, because they could be turned off. So at a time of war, you want to get your missiles to Hawaii or onto Guam, load them onto a ship, and the crane doesn't work because the Chinese have turned it off. Why fight if you can turn off America? And there's plenty more. I mean, whether you talk about logistics, you want to reduce New York to chaos, knock out the traffic light system, which will have cellular modules in it. If the Chinese, if it's a monopoly, they can do that. Pipelines, your telecoms, your routers, most a horrible percentage of routers now already have Chinese cellular modules in, and the data becomes vulnerable. Might be enciphered, but quantum may well sort out that encipherment in a few years' time. And certainly the metadata is vulnerable. And for instance, if you plug your iPhone into your car's audio system, well, good luck. I think it's very unwise because the data on your iPhone is accessible through the cellular module to the manufacturer of the car for sure, but also possibly if it's a Chinese cellular module and they're interested in you, to China. And the UK had an incident 2 and a bit years ago where our security services pulled apart a government car because it was data was emanating through the cellular module, through the eSIM, as the press called it, to China. They didn't say whose car it was, and they didn't say what the data was. I happen to know it was the Prime Minister's car, and they wouldn't go for any ordinary civil servants. Of course, they go for someone who's important. So you can do that. So there are a lot of solutions that we need to think about in dealing with this threat. I mean, if I very briefly, Rick, and I'm not sure how much time I've got, do yell. If we need to deal with this threat, the first, and I'm talking here not just about the cellular module threat, but about the broader science and technology threat, then I think the first thing to do is that we have to recognize it, that we have to be knowledgeable about it and more aware about it. And perhaps in the States you are. I have to say that here in the United Kingdom, we're not nearly as much as we should be. And in Europe, I honestly would say, I've worked in Europe for some years, even less so. When I go over to talk to them, it sometimes worries me. So first of all, knowledge for sure. Knowledge, for instance, I mean, again, in the States, the effort that's needed to keep up with what's going on. Chinese companies metastasize. So I might say, well, Quectel's a real problem. But Quectel is already setting up, quotes, American companies. Doesn't get around the problem from the point of view of your security because the technology is the same and they still have access and they can still disrupt and you're still reliant on them in terms of dependencies. But you need to be able to, you need to follow those. We need far more research done on China's science and technology. We need our intelligence services to be targeting on finding out exactly what they're up to and how they're weaponizing it against us. If I were to advise my government and say, well, what do you do about it in dealing with the threat? Well, I think one of the things I would say is you don't need to be so afraid in actually taking measures against science and technology. So people will say to you, yes, but we can't be too nasty to China in this area, otherwise they'll hit our trade, our exports and our investment. And then I say to people, just look at the facts, please, because every country that's been in the doghouse with China diplomatically, their exports have risen during that period, everyone. Or look at the investment figures for your country. Certainly for my country, Chinese investment is 0.2 of our investment stock. And the number of jobs it's brought, I looked at that at the height, 3 years, it was equivalent to 3,000 jobs a year, not very much. So you don't need to be afraid. The next thing I'd say to our government, and I say to our government all the time, is get a strategy. Actually have a set of policies, more generally on how you're dealing with China, but of course, then within that, look at the area of science and technology. Do what the Australians did. They've got a foreign interference office, I forget the full title, to look at these sorts of problems. Strengthen existing legislation and implement it properly. Actually, here in the UK, in the last few years, we have produced some quite good legislation. We have a National Security Investment Act. We have a National Security Act, which has the equivalent of your FARA, your foreign whatever it is, agent's registration. I always forget these damn initials, but ours is FIRS, the Foreign Interest Registration Scheme. China isn't yet on the enhanced tier, but maybe it should be. We look at visas much more carefully in science and technology. There's a scheme for that. We have a research collaboration agreement advisory team, which was set up a few years to talk to universities and advise them what they should and shouldn't be doing in science and technology. And I think people are more convinced over here anyway that working with universities rather than imposing upon them is probably going to get a better result in terms of defending our technology and not collaborating in things that really shouldn't be collaborated on. There are many other things. I mean, in terms of incoming technology, we here in the UK passed a Procurement Act 18 months ago. And we have a debarment list, which is a bit like one of your, what do you call them? Sorry, it's gone out of my mind. But you have these lists too of technologies which shouldn't be allowed in. Again, I think if government sends a strong message, in our case, for instance, when it comes to cellular modules, if eventually when this act gets into this debarment list, it starts to be populated. If you start putting companies that produce, Chinese companies that produce cellular modules in, that means that any company bidding for a government procurement, if somewhere in their own supply chain is that Chinese module, you're not allowed to bid. And that will certainly start changing the way that companies source their supplies. So there's lots to be done in terms of designated trusted suppliers, and filling out that concept. I've gabbled through, Rick, and I hope, because I haven't got a watch on me, and I turned my phone off so it didn't go off, that I'm roughly on time and haven't overspent.
Yep, terrific. Thank you, Charlie. Well, a lot to cover. So just to, as a starting point, and this goes back to the beginning of your talk, but several of our participants are pushing back, saying, "Well, don't all countries do these sorts of things? Doesn't the United States try to dominate technologies?" Can you go over that early part again for people who may have missed it, just briefly?
Yes, I mean, of course they do, and companies also have their own incentives for trying to dominate the market. But I think there's a big difference in that I tried to emphasize that this is a whole of state approach for a start, and that the system of subsidies, cheap land, cheap finance, is a very powerful tool in ensuring that these particular companies are able to undercut and undermine. If you take the cellular module world, for instance, I've talked to people in the business and they will say that there is simply no way that they could produce at that cost, which usually is about 20 to 25% less than us. We also have manufactured in China and know what it costs, but we can't match them because we don't have those sorts of subsidies, and that is, it's a state policy to ensure that those companies knock out the opposition. So I think there is a qualitative difference in the nature of that threat. I mean, you might say, well, for Chinese, good on the Chinese Communist Party because they're just a hell of a lot more disciplined about it, and their system and model enables them to weaponize it in a way that perhaps we can't. Attempts going on in the States to weaponize it.
Yeah, I mean, you also talk a lot about developing a monopoly, but do they really need a monopoly? I mean, it isn't just the overwhelming, majority of cellular modules probably now are already Chinese made, and they're already well established in, our refrigerators, our cars, whatever. Doesn't this sort of the horse, the barn door open after the horse leaves? I mean, are you closing it after it's gone?
Well, actually, as it happens in cellular modules, no, it isn't. I don't have the most recent figures, but certainly 2023, I think the Chinese companies had 30% of the North American market, 35% of the European market, 89% of the Indian market. And the global figure is quite high, but then China is such an enormous place that it kind of skews that. So the other figures are more relevant. The other thing about cellular modules is that they're not particularly high tech. It's not difficult to set up an industry or indeed to ramp up production. So that if you banned tomorrow Chinese cellular modules on national security grounds, it wouldn't be difficult to replace them very, very quickly.
Here's an interesting question from Peter Bigelow from Automotive News in Detroit. In terms of dependencies, China has created one with lithium-ion batteries and the materials used to build them, especially given the Northvolt bankruptcy yesterday in Europe. Is the best approach for the US and EU to not rely on these batteries from China, i.e. not transition to electric vehicles and instead maintain internal combustion vehicles, or look at an alternative like hydrogen fuel cells?
Well, I wouldn't profess to be an expert in whether we could eventually produce our own electric vehicles. But one of the things certainly that slightly puzzles me over here in the UK, where we put some very stringent demands on the percentages that manufacturers must produce of electric vehicles, is I can't help thinking that wouldn't it have been better, rather than saying that by 2030 whatever percentage it is must be electric, you would say, well, by 2030, if you're producing an internal combustion engine vehicle, it must do 75 miles to the gallon, and by 2035 it's got to do 100, and that will sure as hell cut down the size and probably, I suspect, encourage the technologists to work quite hard, which might go relatively close to the environmental concerns that electric cars are meant to solve. After all, if you add up the whole process of an electric vehicle, from the moment stuff is dragged out of the ground, lithium, through heavier vehicles, the destruction on the roads, the pollution from tires, whatever, I'm sure that electric vehicles are less polluting. But again, maybe the guy who asked the question could tell us more than I can as to whether you couldn't actually even up that equation considerably.
Bev Burden asks an interesting question. Former FBI Director Chris Wray was laser focused on potential technology-related threats to the U.S. How concerned should we be, and our allies, about personnel changes in the FBI vis-a-vis these threats?
Well, that's a question for an American to answer rather than a Brit. All I would say is that if those personnel changes mean that you're moving away from what Director Wray said, because I think he talked an awful lot of sense, and he said exactly the same as the directors of our intelligence agencies over here, that if the new personnel are moving away from that, I would be extremely worried. Very worried.
Jane Marie Hardy, good question. The UK is no longer in the EU, as you well know, but do you have insights into how EU regulations balance ICT competition policies / laws with the need to protect devices? Are there lessons for the rest of us from the EU experiences in finding this balance?
Well, again, I wouldn't profess to be an expert on EU law. I mean, I'm not overly optimistic about EU processes. Having worked there for 5 years, I was in the EU delegation in Beijing, if only because the lack of unity in the EU between the member states. Of course, I speak as a Brit, and we were the ones perhaps who were the least unified of all by leaving it. So I'm in no real position to speak, but whatever area it is, in terms of, but in the one I'm looking at, in terms of combating the threat from China in science and technology, First of all, I would say that my own experience of talking to some of you officials about this is that it's there is not a great deal of knowledge. There certainly wasn't when it came to cellular modules, but also it's very difficult to get all 27 countries really on message and taking it seriously. Hungary is an obvious example as to one that won't, but even in Germany and Spain and others at times are not going as hard on this subject as I would like, and we shouldn't forget that most of the decision making on these issues, particularly on national security and economic security, lies with the countries. It doesn't lie with the EU Commission. So the EU Commission can lay down the law on trade issues because that's a competence that it owns, but it can't on these other things.
Moving on from cellular modules to some of the other technological issues, AI in particular, do you have any insights into the impact of, for example, DeepSeek on the technological power balance between China and the rest of the world?
I won't confirm. I mean, I'm not a scientist, right? I've got interested in this one aspect, cellular modules, because it is so. It's an easy example to use with politicians to get them to understand what the threat is. So I wouldn't want to be, quoted as an authority on AI. What would I say about that? I think the Chinese domestically are going to have quite an interesting set of problems in controlling it so that it doesn't threaten their ability to control information, control the narrative. I think that's an interesting angle. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how they, I'm going to say use AI. I don't mean that. I mean how they deal with it in an international context in terms of bringing the global south in particular onto their side, using AI as a tool, because they've already set up the global, I mean, you'll remember the three initiatives: the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. They are in effect setting up a global technology initiative, but they haven't named it as such yet. But it's the GAIG, and I'm desperately trying to think what those damn initials stand for, but it's the Global AI Governance. That's it, Global AI Governance Initiative, which Xi Jinping makes quite a lot of, actually. You'll see it appearing in quite a lot of speeches and documents. And again, that is a part of this strategy of co-opting the global south against your country, Western countries, and using sharing of AI or governance of it as an issue, and contrasting perhaps their more open, as they would say, DeepSeek than some of our AI endeavors.
Dan Saltman says, so in the face of these global initiatives, what might the West do to sort of counteract them, or at least provide some alternative, especially for global AI?
Yes, well, the answer I would give now is somewhat different than what I might have given a couple of months ago, because I think that I'm afraid to say that what Mr. Trump has done globally, internationally, has made it an awful lot more difficult for the West to take united measures in any sphere, and this, I think, is just another example of that. So I guess that would be the first thing that I would say. But I'm not sure whether I can actually add anything specific to. I mean, I've talked about a number of measures that governments should take, and unity between governments is uh, you know, one of the main themes, but one of the most difficult. I mean, talked about how the EU finds it difficult, even though they're all members of the EU, actually to come to the same positions on these areas. How difficult is it going to be in the current world for the West to stand together on this one? I think we have to make big efforts, and the UK government did hold a big conference on AI back last year, and I hope those, I'm sure those efforts will continue, but they've been made more difficult.
Just a little flashback, or a hobby horse, I guess, perhaps. So how responsible do you think Xi Jinping is for this offensive, if you will? Is this just where the Chinese Communist Party was always headed in terms of given the technological changes of the last 20 years anyway? Or was this something that we can attribute to Xi Jinping's leadership?
Well, it depends whether you're talking about the broader sort of foreign policy or particularly science and technology, or maybe both. But if I talk about the broader one first, I would say that actually anti-Americanism has been the foundation stone of Chinese foreign policy for as long as I can remember. There have been periods when it's been less pronounced and less talked about, but I don't think the party has ever really seen you guys and the system that you and we have established as anything else than as a threat to itself. Is when it comes to science and technology, well, I mean, the speed of science and technological development has increased, and not surprisingly, Xi Jinping has wanted to ride that wave. So I think he clearly, I mean, given that he's been now in power for nearly 13 years, 12, 13 years, and that's been the period where science and technology really has started to move very fast. Then, of course, given that he's in control, one, I think, does have to say that the pushing and the policies are his, because most things in China are. But I think he very, very deeply believes in that. It's a theme of all his speeches. If you look at the recent National People's Congress and what he chooses to say when he meets the various delegations, these are carefully chosen topics. Science and technology is a big one.
Well, it's essential to the growth of the Chinese economy, which has been flagging. You know, we can have another discussion over whether or not the Chinese governmental model, which is very good at pushing certain things quickly, like fast trains or whatever, is best for innovation and in the long run, and true innovation, true invention.
But it's not just domestically. I mean, of course, science and technology is domestically very important to try and pull out of what's a difficult economy at the moment. But as I said, in terms of foreign policy, I think that he sees it as the main battlefield.
Yeah. Can you speak to the digital Silk Road and the UK's position on participation or competition, especially in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I always object to the term Silk Road and Belt and Road Initiative on the grounds that it doesn't exist. I mean, of course it does, but what I mean is that the Belt and Road and all the rest, these are slogans which we shouldn't, digital Silk Road, etc. We shouldn't get too hung up on about, but look at the reality behind it. Is the UK? I mean, is the question that is the UK cooperating with the Chinese in the building of that road, or are we trying to compete with them? If it's the former, then I don't think we are trying to help them. I mean, we somewhat belatedly saw the light on Huawei ourselves. So it would hardly be likely that we would then push cooperation with China in telecommunications abroad.
You mentioned at the beginning, you used the term co-opting global science, which I found interesting. And it's more, I mean, this is, yeah, can you elaborate on that just a little bit? What you mean by that? What are the modalities of China trying to co-opt global science?
Well, I think it's, I can't remember if did I use that phrase, but I certainly it's trying to dominate it. But in terms of I think I'm not sure I did use that phrase. But what I mean is what I do think is that it's got and has had since the 50s very detailed programs and aims and intentions and set down. You can occasionally read them on the obtaining of technology abroad, and it spends an awful lot of time and effort doing that, and it's been very successful. If you look at some of the cases, you know, in my own country recently, Imagination Technologies producing one of the, I think probably the only company outside the US that produces sort of technologies that are vital to GPUs. And what happened? This Imagination Technologies was taken over by the Chinese, and the British government allowed it to happen, despite the fact that the so-called fund that was taking it over, venture capital fund, was owned, which was, quotes, a private organization, but it only had one funder, which was the Chinese state-owned company. Now, venture capital's funds don't usually have one funder. The whole point is that you divide the risk. And it only invested in one company, which was Imagination Technologies. And again, that's hardly spreading the risk. So it wasn't difficult to see what was going on. And indeed, you guys had actually stopped Canyon Bridge from investing in some of your other companies. So there's an example of, if you like to call it co-opting. I could go on at length as to how that happened, but it was not a pretty saga in terms of how some of the permissions were granted or things weren't looked at carefully enough. But that is an example, I think, of a very definite plan from the start to get hold of a sensitive technology, because it can be very much used in military and missile applications. Yeah, I think the plan has worked. So is that co-opting as technology?
Well, I mean, I thought, maybe I misheard, but I thought it more in terms of getting foreign scientists to, you know, come to China or, you know, sort of, and that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, that of course is true, and one of the things that the United Front Work Department does, so what the United Front work does, is this sort of forward radar for a whole load of things, but not least science and technology, but so do Chinese PhD students and others, and for sure, I can think of some fairly egregious, if not outrageous, examples here in the UK of well-known scientists who go to China and do what you and I, Rick, know is a very common thing, where you go, you get invited, you get all expenses paid, a large honorarium, top hotel, and you give a lecture or two, and then on the side of it they say, and by the way, our experts are having a very interesting problem in this field, would love to talk to you separately. And then you have an expert, as we have in the UK, talking about railguns or something quite extraordinary.
Right. All right. Well, thanks very much, Charlie. It was terrific. Actually, I was telling my colleagues, you know, we met just about 40 years ago. So, but you look a lot younger than that. So, sorry for revealing your true age.
I look a lot older than I did 40 years ago.
Yeah. Anyway, this was terrific. I really appreciate you taking the time, and you know, look forward to seeing you soon. And Charlie produces a lot of analysis papers for Geostrategy. We'll provide the link to their website for anybody who's interested. It's a much more detailed exposition of these issues than we were able to get through to today. Thanks very much, Charlie.